The Nikon D750. Is it a camera still worth buying in 2020? That's the question that I'm going to try and answer in this week's video. And to cut a long story short, I personally feel it is, and I'm going to share with you some of the reasons why I feel that way. If you've been following my channel, you'll know that I've had a bit of a roller coaster experience with my camera equipment. To cut a long story short, basically I bought the Nikon D750 in 2014 at launch. I used it successfully for about 3 years, absolutely loved the camera, but in 2017 I upgraded to the Nikon D850. That camera was subsequently destroyed by a rogue wave a couple of months ago, and due to insurance complications and budget constraints, I've actually repurchased a Nikon D750 as a replacement. As you can see, I have extensive experience with the Nikon D750 going all the way back to its launch, and I have the relatively unusual perspective of moving back to this camera body after having used a higher spec system. So I thought I'd put this video together to show you why I feel it has aged tremendously well, why the D750 is still a fantastic camera, and why for some it's still worthy of consideration for buying in 2020. I'm joined by a very naughty kitten on today's video, so if you hear any squeals, meows, or just generally the camera tripod getting attacked, you know who's the culprit. It's worth making clear that I am a landscape photographer, so my evaluation of the pros and cons of this camera are not comprehensive by any means and are going to be framed by my specific experience. But hopefully, if you're looking for a new Nikon full frame camera, or if you're just generally intrigued by the D750, hopefully this video will be useful for you. So why is the case for buying the D750 still so strong over 5 years after its release? Well, for me, the number one reason is great value. You can pick up the D750 camera body for about £980 new now, and I personally bought mine second hand for about £600. Now, that's obviously still a lot of money, but relatively speaking, when you're looking at the capabilities and the spec of the camera, that's actually quite great value, and I think at its current price point it really offers quite a compelling proposition compared to the more expensive systems on the market. Reason 2, it's lightweight and compact. It clocks in at about 840 grams for the camera body. Now admittedly that is heavier than a lot of the mirrorless systems out there, but when you're comparing it to a lot of other full frame DSLR options out there, the D750 is a great deal lighter and more compact than virtually all of them, and in my experience it's a great camera for taking on long treks and walks where you're carrying a lot of weight. Really on those kind of trips, every gram that you can save in your camera bag goes a long way. Therefore I think the D750 packs a lot of punch into quite a small body. The next strength is a real big one of this camera. Its low light, high ISO performance is awesome. It really is. And personally, having used the D850 for a while and now coming back to use the D750, it's made me realise just how good it is in this area. I would say it at least performs as good as the D850, but I would probably make an argument that it actually performs better than the D850, which is quite amazing. And I think the reason for that is they're using a similar size sensor, but because the D750 is packing less resolution into that space, it's less susceptible to high ISO noise in the images. And I think the D750 for astrophotography is an exceptionally good camera. It still sits very high in that sort of niche, I would say, and there's probably not that many cameras out there that probably outperform it. I certainly know from my experience of using it for astrophotography, the images it outputs are just absolutely beautiful, and yeah, if you're particularly interested in that sort of area, I couldn't recommend it more. Also, it's worth noting that the autofocus in low light situations is also pretty awesome. The next strength is dual SD cards. Now here is my D750 with me right now. You open up the side and it can write to the dual SDs, and I think this is really valuable. Not only are SD cards a really affordable storage medium compared to the likes of XQD cards, which I used to use with the D850, but I don't like using cameras that only write to a single card, because I love the ability to back up your images to 2 cards, because corrupted SD cards or memory cards of any type are a risk, and it does happen, and when it does happen, it's absolutely devastating. So to have that insurance policy of writing to dual cards is invaluable. The next thing I love about this camera is actually the tilting LCD on the back. It's really useful for shooting at low angles on a tripod or high. Cat's just playing with everything. It's really useful for shooting at low angles close to the ground or high angles that kind of sit above you. It really comes into its own, and you only really know the value of using tilting LCDs or articulating LCDs until you use a camera that doesn't have them. The next strength for this camera is durability and reliability. Now, I have to say the weather sealing on the D750 is exceptional. The particular circumstance which killed my D850, for example, I'm not sure whether it would kill the D750. I've put my D750s through absolute pain and torture on my travels over the years. I've taken the D750 to places like Patagonia, into the heart of Africa, into Botswana, to Myanmar and various other locations around the world, into challenging conditions in terms of heat and cold and moisture and dust, and the D750 has never let me down. It is an absolute unit, and potentially out of all the cameras I've used over the last sort of 12 years of photography, I'd make a strong argument that the D750 is actually the most robust and reliable. The dynamic range on this camera is brilliant. Now admittedly it's not as good as the D850, but that's not a fair comparison. For a 5-year-old sensor, the dynamic range on this camera is beautiful. It has 14.5 EVS, meaning that you can expose for your shadows and highlights quite often within a single exposure without the need for graduated filters and bracketing, which is tremendously useful. And at ISO 100, I think the image quality that you get out of this camera is absolutely superb. The next benefit to this camera is its resolution. This has a 24.3 megapixel sensor. Now this is both a pro and a con, but I'll start with the good points. As I alluded to earlier in the video, the tremendous low light performance of this camera is partly down to the actual resolution of this sensor, but there's a lot of other benefits. General editing, processing, storage and workflow on images is a lot snappier and just generally quicker when you're using smaller file sizes, and there's a lot to be said for that. And also generally, I would say for the vast majority of my printing, 24 megapixels is absolutely perfectly sufficient. I really have to push the size quite high indeed before I start to see any real noticeable diminishment in print quality. And of course for online use, for social media, etc., there's absolutely no benefit to those high resolutions. So I would say even in 2020, the 24 megapixel sensor is still very competitive, and for the vast majority of purposes, it's absolutely sufficient. If you're wondering what this absurd sort of thing here is, this is basically my L plate off my old deceased D850, and I'm trying to recycle it on this D750. It looks a bit absurd, but it still works. Just the last few benefits to this camera. The battery life is fantastic. I can't really complain. You can get a huge amount of images. You can shoot basically all day on a battery. And also generally, I would say the ergonomics and button layout on this camera is just superb. It just feels really good in the hand. Hard to articulate why, but sometimes things just feel right, and this is just a camera that I've always loved to shoot with. It just feels superb. There are a few key weaknesses to this camera, but remember, it's a 5-year-old system, so I'm going to try and be firm but fair with my critique. The number one thing that I dislike with it is its video. It may have been acceptable back in 2014, but by 2020 standards, it sucks. It's clunky, it's limited on features, the autofocus is atrocious, and generally it's not that enjoyable to use. The next weakness is the lack of touch sensitivity on the LCD screen. Now, as they say, you don't miss what you've never had, but having used the D850 for a number of years, I can honestly say I do miss this feature. The D750 by comparison just feels a little bit slower and a little bit clunkier to use in the absence of that feature. The next weakness of this camera is its resolution. Now, earlier in the video, I talked about the pros of the resolution. I'm going to talk about the cons of the resolution now. Now, this point, I'll put the disclaimer here, this could be down to the fact that I've been totally spoilt by using a 45.7 megapixel camera for the last few years, and I've become accustomed to shooting at that higher resolution. But when I was shooting with the D850, I found that I could aggressively crop images, and because I was shooting with that higher resolution, I never felt scared to crop away large portions of an image. There was always perfectly sufficient detail in there to allow me to do that. But I have to say, with the D750, I tend to be more reluctant to crop my images because I know I'm working with less resolution in that image, and that can be detrimental, I think, that constraint, because the ability to aggressively crop images can vastly improve your photography. I know over my photography career, if you can call it a career, the ability to crop images can transform the quality of images. So it's just something to be wary of. It's probably all in my head. There's probably not that much detrimental impact to the images of even cropping at 24 megapixel, but hey, I'm just being honest about how I feel. That's about it for the significant weaknesses. There are a number of other things, like the fact that the max shutter speed on this is 1/4000th of a second. Its buffer for continuous shooting runs out after 12 images. Its max frames per second is 6.5. It only has 51 autofocus points, and its max ISO is 12,800. For me personally, all of those points don't really cause me too much pain, but they could be showstoppers for you depending on your circumstances. Now, obviously there's going to be a whole host of other weaknesses when closely compared to higher spec DSLRs or new mirrorless systems. However, for me, the extremely competitive price of the D750 when compared to these alternate systems is what breathes new life into this aging camera in 2020. The D750 is an exceptional camera for landscape photography, I find, but it's not a camera that will suit everyone. There's an increasingly compelling case to invest into mirrorless systems, which are unquestionably going to be the future. I'd be lying to you if I said that I wasn't keeping one eye open on new mirrorless developments in the months and year ahead. Overall, I would say that if price isn't a main consideration factor for you, then the case for getting a D750 compared to these other systems starts to fade away somewhat. However, for landscape photography, the Nikon D750 continues to offer a compelling full frame package at a very competitive price. As I alluded to earlier in the video, I had insurance complications with my D850 that was destroyed by a wave. I have actually now been compensated, so I could in theory go out and buy a new Nikon D850, or perhaps invest into the Nikon Z systems like the Z6 or the Z7, for example. However, I have chosen not to do that. partly because I want to see what the developments in the mirrorless sector are going to be in the months and year ahead, but also it's because I think the D750 is perfectly sufficient for me, and it's testament to how good this camera is. I've got the opportunity to go out and buy better cameras in terms of the spec, but this continues to hold its own over 5 years after its release. It's a phenomenal camera. Additionally, there are rumours that Nikon are going to be releasing a D760 at some point in the near future. I can't really comment too much on that because I've got no idea if it's true or what the specs are, but what I do know is the release of such a camera, combined with Nikon continuing to push their Z systems, is going to put the D750 price under real pressure. So the prices that I quoted to you earlier in the video, they're only going to come down, which is going to make the proposition of this camera even stronger. Finally, don't get too hung up on getting the latest camera gear. It's so easy to fall into the trap of looking at other photographers who have got better equipment and feeling somehow that devalues the photography that you are creating. Trust me, it really doesn't. I am using a 5-year-old camera now that is arguably inferior to the camera that I had before in terms of pure specs. However, in the last couple of months using the D750, I've probably created some of my strongest images of the last year, to be honest. So it just goes to show that the camera you use really only plays a real small part in the actual output and the quality of the photography that you create. So really try and avoid getting too hung up on getting the latest gear. So thanks very much for joining me and Misty today. If you've got any thoughts on the D750, then pop them down in the comments. I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts on the camera. And if you haven't yet subscribed to the channel, please hit that subscribe button for more videos just like this in the future. And yeah, I think that's it really. Nothing more to say on the D750. It's awesome. I'll see you all soon. Take care. Goodbye.